Hey guys, today we're going over smooth muscle and how calcium plays into that, as well as some of the enzymes that work in the cycle. We're still working with actin and myosin, but it's a little different from skeletal muscle. To start out, there's two different types of smooth muscle contraction, and that's phasic as well as tonic. In phasic contraction, that's kind of like your gut going through peristalsis. Pretty phasic, meaning like it's only going to happen at certain times or when it's stimulated at certain times, right? And then tonic is going to be found in places like sphincters, wherein you're going to increase a contraction or hold a contraction for long periods of time without using a lot of ATP such that you fatigue. So let's jump into it. Let's start with the phasic state, and we'll start up here where we have myosin, which has been phosphorylated and has ADP attached to, and it's cocked. So starting up here, we're going to go through a phase to where this myosin head attaches to the actin. But in order for that to happen, we have to add another phosphate to myosin so that it has enough energy to actually attach, because it's different from skeletal muscle where you have tropomyosin, which you need to move out of the way. Smooth muscle doesn't have troponin to move tropomyosin out of the way, so you need a little bit more energy to attach it to actin. So in order to phosphorylate that myosin head, there's a process that we go through, and it starts with calmodulin. And so calmodulin will have 4 binding sites for calcium. And what that's going to do is once calcium binds to calmodulin, it's going to bend into a shape that's then going to hit MLCK. And MLCK, if you look up here, inactivated, is going to kind of look like it has its foot in its mouth. It's inactive. So that calmodulin complex with calcium on it is then going to bind with that MLCK and activate it, which breaks open that, or takes the foot out of the mouth of the MLCK, which stands for myosin light chain kinase, right? So we've now opened myosin light chain kinase and activated it, and what myosin light chain kinase can do is now phosphorylate this myosin head and add another phosphate group to it. And so that gives it a little bit more kick, so to speak, such that the myosin head can attach to actin. It is now cocked, it's in a high energy state, we're attached to actin, we're good to go. So in the phasic stage, it kind of runs runs a little bit like skeletal muscle. You're attached and you're cocked. Then your phosphate group and your ADP is going to detach from the myosin head, which will be sort of like a power stroke then, which will pull on the actin and they'll slide, increasing the contraction, right? So now we're uncocked and we have a low energy state, but we still have that phosphate group attached from the myosin light chain kinase. And so that phosphate's still on there. But we are uncocked. We've already gone through our power stroke by taking off ADP and phosphate, and we're at a low energy state. From here, we will now add ATP back onto the myosin head. And that will help us to detach from actin, just like in skeletal muscle, but in this case, smooth muscle. That helps us detach from actin. We're still in a low energy state. And this is a little nuance here. If this phosphate group from MLCK stays on and there's enough calcium in the intercellular fluid, you'll just go straight across to this previous phase where we're attached to actin, and the cycle will start all over. So we'll skip this step up here in this corner. But so ATPase will hydrolyze that ATP that just attached, and then we'll head over to here where we start the cycle over again. Where phasic contraction can stop though and relax is when an enzyme called myosin light chain phosphatase steps in. And so what that phosphatase will do is it'll clip off this phosphate group that was previously attached from the MLCK. So once we clip that phosphate off, we relax and we are now again, we hydrolyze the ATP and we're again at a phosphate group and ADP alone, and we're detached from actin, right? What can influence MLCP though, or the phosphatase enzyme, is Rho kinase. And what Rho kinase will do is inactivate myosin light chain phosphatase by phosphorylating MLCP. And if you look at MLCP, it kind of looks like Pac-Man. The phosphate group basically clamps Pac-Man's mouth shut so that it can't clip off the phosphate group from your myosin head. And so that will deactivate it and continue this cycle of where your phosphate group stays on. It's not clipped off by MLCP. This is dependent upon the amount of calcium in this intercellular fluid, because it influences your ratio of Rho kinase to MLCP. If you have a higher ratio of MLCP to Rho kinase, then you're going to be clipping off more phosphate groups and you're going to be relaxing more. If you have more Rho kinase enzyme active, then it's going to inactivate MLCP, and then you're going to keep this phosphate group on and continue cycles, right? So now we move on to tonic. It goes through the same calmodulin calcium MLCK complex up here in this right corner. We start at the same position where we just have phosphate group and ADP attached. But what will happen is we'll be phosphorylated with MLCK and we'll attach to actin. Now we're attached and we're cocked, high energy state. But because we have an offset ratio of MLCP to MLCK, we have more phosphatases in this cell. And so MLCP, because there's more of them and it's not inactivated, it's going to become so active that it can clip off that phosphate group at this phase of the game. So up here, we were able to cycle normally, and basically the last step, MLCP functioned and clipped off phosphate. In this stage, we do that earlier in about step 4 and so we go through this uncocking, we're power stroking, right? But because we don't have a phosphate group here anymore, because MLCP clipped it off, we will now stay in this uncocked or locked in phase to actin for longer. So we're still going to get ATP back onto the myosin head, right? But because we don't have that extra phosphate to give us enough kick to detach, it actually helps us detach too. Because we don't have that extra kick to detach, we'll stay in a latched state for longer. And it will eventually dissociate from actin, the myosin head, but it'll take so much longer. And so what this does is now we are latched onto actin for a longer period of time. We use less ATP to stay contracted, and that's why you won't fatigue, because you're stuck on there for a longer period of time. I want to move back up here to the top and how we get calcium into the cell. That is greatly influenced by this sarcoplasmic reticulum. Just like in skeletal muscle, calcium will come through there. But the difference here is in skeletal muscle, you'll have dihydropyridine receptors, but in smooth muscle, you don't have those. It's just your ryanodine receptors, which will let calcium out. Another pathway that calcium can influence all of these cycles is through an IP3 secondary messenger pathway, and that will also attach to the sarcoplasmic reticulum and let out calcium as well. So calcium plays a big role in this, and it's very different from skeletal muscle in that we don't have troponin with smooth muscle. Troponin doesn't move the tropomyosin. It's just this extra phosphate group that helps us attach to actin and give us a little bit more kick to do that. And yeah, regulation is based on calcium, as well as your ratios of rho kinase to myosin light chain phosphatase. If you have more myosin light chain phosphatase, then you could potentially go through this state where you clip off a phosphatase earlier in the cycle, influencing it such that a latch state occurs and it takes longer to dissociate the myosin from the actin. And vice versa, if you have more rho kinase than MLCP, then you'll inactivate more MLCPs, and then you'll stay in a phasic state where you're just going through this phosphorylated myosin head for multiple cycles, as long as calcium is available. And so yeah, that's how smooth muscle contraction works, and how our guts and our sphincters essentially function.